This Shabbos, Emir Hashem, we're going to read Tazria-Hachodeh, and that parsha begins with the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. Most of the parsha focuses on the Korban Pesach, the highlight of Chag HaPesach that's coming up, Be'ezras Hashem. What's interesting is that the name of this Korban, the Korban Pesach, is mentioned just once in the entire Parshas HaChodesh. It's described as the basar, as the seh, but one time the Torah gives it a name, Pesach Hu LaHashem. Why is it called the Korban Pesach? As we know from the Seder, Pesach al Shema, Hashem Shepasach al B'Tevnei Yisrael. Rashi here on the pasuk quotes it that the Korban is called a Pesach to recall that Kadosh Baruch Hu skipped over the houses of the Jews. When the destructive force, the Mashchis, was destroying the Bechorei Mitzrayim, the Bechorei Yisrael were saved. Beyond just a name, beyond just borrowing the term Pesach to name the Korban, this name actually indicates one of the essential features of the Korban Pesach, as we will see. The Ramban in Parshas Beha'aloscha, Perek Tes, Pasuk Yedalid, the Ramban is bothered by a question. The Torah tells us here in Parshas Bo, not in Parshas HaChodesh, but in the subsequent Parshios, that one of the halachos of the Korban Pesach is that not only is a born Jew chayav in Korban Pesach, even a ger is chayav. The Torah in Parshas Beha'aloscha there is describing the Korban Pesach that Klal Yisrael brought in the Midbar, in the second year in the Midbar, and there the Torah repeats again that a ger is chayav in Korban Pesach. And the question is, why does that have to be repeated? Isn't it obvious if the Korban Pesach was brought in Mitzrayim and a ger was chayav, then of course, l'dorei doros, when the Korban Pesach is brought, whether in the Midbar or subsequently in Eretz Yisrael, a ger should be chayav. So Ramban explains as follows. The Korban Pesach that was brought in Mitzrayim, what's known as the Pesach Mitzrayim, was a very special event that occurred once in history. He says that you may have thought that only born Jews would have been chayav. However, Gerim as well. The Torah tells us in Parshas Bo that Gerim as well are chayav in Pesach Mitzrayim. Why? Says Ramban, Sha'af hein hayu be'osa hanes. They too were involved in the miracle. The Ramban goes on to explain, but you may have thought l'dorei doros, Gerim would not be chayav in Korban Pesach because, says Ramban, Osanu hotzi misham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out. The born Jews can relate back and say, like we say in the Haggadah, B'chol davar chayav an l'irus atzmo, ki hu yatzam Mitzrayim, shenemar ve'osanu hotzi misham. We came out of Mitzrayim. We who were born into the Klal Yisrael. We could look back and say, we came out of Mitzrayim as well. Ki ilu yatzanu Mitzrayim. Maybe Gerim wouldn't be able to say such a thing. Kamash B'lan, the Torah tells us in Parshas Beha'aloscha, no, l'dorei doros as well. Every ger becomes a member of Klal Yisrael. Every ger becomes part of the bris of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and every ger can look back and say, I too left Mitzrayim. And that is why one of the explanations of why at the Leil HaSeder we say the story of Akiva and his friends in Bnei Brak, that each of those Tanoim maybe had a reason not to be being marbe and sibur tzitz Mitzrayim. Rabbi Akiva, who's a ben gerim, maybe you wouldn't be marbe and sibur tzitz Mitzrayim. Kamash Malano, even a ben gerim, even a ger himself can look at Yetzias Mitzrayim and say, I too came out because he too is part of Klal Yisrael. But let's go back a step. The Ramban explains that the reason why the gerim in Mitzrayim, who were the gerim in Mitzrayim? The Erev Rav, the gerim in Mitzrayim, they too were chayav in Pesach Mitzrayim. Why? Says Ramban, Av hein hayu ba'osa hanes. That's a very surprising idea, a fascinating idea. Av hein is normally found, first of all, when it comes to mitzvos derabanan, Ner Chanukah, Mikra Megillah, Arba Kosos. But more fundamentally, Av hein hayu ba'osa hanes is an idea that always designates a mitzvah as being a mitzvah of Pirsumei Nisa. A mitzvah whose definition is to be mefarsei hanes, to publicize a miracle, to call attention to a miracle that was done. And Ramban is telling us that when the Torah decided to call this Korban, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided this Korban should be called a Pesach LaHashem, the term Pesach is not just to recall some event which happened in history, but it's coming to define the Korban in a certain way. This Korban that we shecht, this Korban that we eat on Leil HaSeder, its goal is to be mefarsei the nes, this specific nes. It's an amazing nes that we don't think about enough. There was a mashchis, there was a force that was destroying every bechor in the land of Mitzrayim. And as much as it's strange to use the term nature in this context, but naturally speaking, that force should have destroyed every bechor, Jew and non-Jew alike. The tremendous hatzalah of Klal Yisrael on that night was that the force, the mashchis, did not kill the Bechorei Yisrael. And the reason for that was because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Kili B'nai Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose us for himself. Once he chose us, the mashchis has no force over us. It's a similar doros that our Bechiras Yisrael, the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose us on that night in Mitzrayim, took us as his nation, would always, V'hi Shamda, would always be a shmira for us. L'dorei doros. The way in which we commemorate that is not just by telling a story, is not just by doing Mitzvahs Halayla, but particularly through the halachic mechanism known as Persumei Nisa, through the halachic mechanism of eating a Korban Pesach and talking about it, being mefarsim the nes and embellishing on the nes, and kol amar b'arei meshubach. And that designation means that anybody involved in the nes, Jew, born Jew, and converted Jew alike, will always be chayiv in the mitzvah. So Ramban is telling us that when we call the Korban Pesach, and we call the Yontif as a whole, Chag HaPesach, what we are reminding ourselves of is the tremendous nes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose us to be his Am HaNivchar, and in that way, saved us from the terrible mashchis that was going through Mitzrayim. We too, b'chol davar dor, are mitzuvim to remember that nes and to see ourselves as part of that nes. And Be'ez Hashem, this coming month, in this wonderful Chodesh of Nisim, the Chodesh of Geula, this Chodesh of the Chag HaPesach, Be'ez Hashem, we should see ourselves as the Am HaNivchar and appreciate what that means. And Be'ez Hashem, we will see the Geula due to that Bechiras Yisrael itself, Mehir V'Yameinu.